All right, officially good evening, ladies and gentlemen. We are going to continue and conclude the part of the course devoted to oral presentation. We're going to have two final volunteers giving oral presentations. And as last time, I asked you to judge in part on the content, the truth of what's being said, and in part on the method of presentation, just as we did last time. Again, I asked you to take notes of crucial points wherever you want to perhaps make volunteer a comment and prepare an estimate in your own mind, essentially positive, mixed, or negative. And we will again pool our thoughts at the end. Again, I ask you to be understanding of the speakers and to put your comments forth in as friendly a spirit as possible. Now, our first speaker this evening is Ms. Cicolella, and she is speaking to just a general audience, right? No special designation, but one unfamiliar with philosophy or objectivism, and her topic is going to be the defense of Romanticism in art. And she'll have 10 minutes for that purpose. Ms. Cicolella.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to speak on the state of contemporary art. And I may say to start that it is rather hellish. We find that within the avant-garde, we have examples of artistic works where an artist nails his own body to his Volkswagen. We have art in which John Cage takes a dead fish and slaps it on the strings of a piano. So you see, Francis Ford Coppola may be right. Artistically, at least, this may be apocalypse now. Audiences still seem to want to go to the movies and have a good story, however. Audiences still seem to want portraits of beautiful things. They still seem to want music that has melody. Intellectuals laugh. They can't imagine why people still want that kind of art. Well, what can we do as a general public? I suggest to you that what we can do is combat art by identifying the kind of art that we want. When we go to an artwork, what we seek is a refueling experience. We work through the week, and then on the weekend, we seek to go to a film in which we can, in a sense, be refueled, be recharged. We go to a museum, and we seek to enjoy ourselves. What we need to say is we don't want mindless entertainment. We want entertainment that will stir us emotionally and that will stimulate us intellectually. I suggest to you that what we want is Romanticism. The kind of Romanticism that maybe is best shown in Cyrano de Bergerac, a hero fighting for what he believes in. Maybe best heard in the music of Tchaikovsky, a music of powerful melodies. Maybe best seen in the sculptures of Rodin, in which man is shown as powerful within any struggle. Romanticism seems very mixed, though. When you try to define it, it seems to have such a wide variety that many people consider Romanticism undefinable. It is that is our task. We must define Romanticism. We must identify its premises in order to defend it. Let's look to the roots of Romanticism. If we look at the German Romantics or the French Romantics, like Friedrich Schiller, like Victor Hugo, we find that they said that Romanticism was defined as being emotional. And that makes some sense. Yes, Romantic works do have very powerful emotion. However, what happened to Romanticism was the emotion became so strong that eventually it lost its contact with reality. Emotion became so strong that Romanticism became irrational. So to find the definition of Romanticism, let's look deeper into this idea of emotion. What is the root of emotion? In the 20th century, we've come to the idea that emotion is rooted in values. that when we value something, we feel positive toward it. When we do not value something, we feel negative for it. So our emotions are tied to the kinds of things that we value. Now we're getting a little closer to what might be the root of Romanticism. How can we value something? The whole idea of values, you see, is on the premise of free will. Without free will, values make no sense. If you can't choose to value something, then you have no values. Your values are merely insignificant. You must have volition or free will in order for the idea of values to make any sense at all. And what I'm suggesting to you now is that now we have reached the root of Romanticism, and that is volition. It is volition that makes values possible. It is values that make emotion possible. And that's why Romanticism has such a strong emphasis on emotion, because it has a strong emphasis on value and therefore has a strong emphasis on free will. So we can get a better, clearer idea, I think, of emotion if we look at some specific people again within Romanticism. If we say that Cyrano then chooses values in the form of his white plume, if you remember that symbol. If we say that Tchaikovsky is struggling to maintain values within the music. If we say that Rodin is showing people trying to hang on to their values, then we're beginning to make some sense out of free will in terms of Romanticism. I'd like to go back to this idea of Romanticism dissolving into irrationalism. The early Romantics were tied to reality. Later on, Romantics became kind of pie in the sky. You know, Romantics got the idea of escapist entertainment, some guy riding off on a white charger, and so on. Romanticism has to be tied to reality. And how do we make choices? How do we attain our values? But only through reason. So I'm not talking about a Romanticism in which reason is not included. Obviously, we're talking about emotions that are based in some sense on some reasonable premises. Let's look at Romanticism and contrast it with a few other kinds of theories. The most obvious one in literature is naturalism. The basic premise of naturalism is deterministic. That is, it is fate that determines what will happen to you. Whether your fate is from social circumstances, whether you've inherited it, whether you had a psychological problem when you were 5 years old that made you an axe murderer, whatever that is, it determined the outcome of the story in the case of literature. If we look at art, we've seen Romanticism replaced by abstraction. That is, figurative art is totally out the window. Subjectivism is in. And when we look at art, we no longer see, say, Rembrandt, but we see Picasso. We see total irrationalism where, you know, if you want to paint somebody with a blue nose, you paint somebody with a blue nose because that's what you feel. That's how you perceive it in your subjective state. Let's look at music. What has replaced romantic music? Well, to a certain extent, in popular music, we've kind of forgotten about melody, and in popular music gotten into a beat idea, a primitive beat, so that the waltzes of the 19th century are replaced with a disco thump. So, as popular audiences, what we are calling for is a romantic vision. We want exciting plots where heroes act upon their values. We want paintings with a clear vision of reality that does not give up beauty. We want melodic music that stirs our emotions. Who does this? Not many people today. We have some people who have romantic values, but they are so mixed that it's difficult to cite a romantic artist. I suggest to you that if you look at the works of Ayn Rand, you will find both romance and realism united. Rand was the person in the 20th century who discovered that the premise of Romanticism is free will. She also mentions that reason is the thing that ties free will to reality. If we look at her work called The Romantic Manifesto, you will see this brought out in detail. However, I think what we have to do as audiences in general is encourage the romanticism within future artists. We have to say to filmmakers, you can be as clever as Hitchcock, but you don't have to be horrible. You can paint like Da Vinci, but you don't have to be naturalistic about it. You can compose as brilliantly as Sondheim, but you don't have to write Sweeney Todd. You can perform with the joy of a stare, but you can do it on the stage of the Met. You don't have to do it in a disco. Reason is on the side of the artist and on the side of the audience. Reality is on the side of the artist and the audience. We can say to artists now, you can uphold romanticism because we've identified its basis. And its basis is volition, and now we can defend it. Thank you.
I want to thank Ms. Ciccadella very much for a jam-packed presentation.
I was going to write slow down. I was going to write quick, but I didn't.
She said she was going to write slow down, but she didn't have time, right? Let's take 1 or 2 minutes just to organize our thoughts, and then we will comment. All right, if you had to give one overall estimate now of your view of this talk, remembering, of course, that it is a very difficult assignment to define and defend Romanticism, which is a very abstract artistic category, in 10 minutes to an audience. In fact, it's impossible as an assignment. So we can't ask, was it completely successfully done, but within the framework of bending a little and seeing to the extent that it would be possible. You have 3 choices, essentially positive, mixed, or negative, and I'll take them in order. Judging, putting into your input both the manner of delivery and the content. How many would say essentially positive? Well, we've got quite a large turnout of positive. How many would say essentially mixed? Slightly less, and essentially negative. Just a scattering. So you obviously have got a good following in the audience here. All right, let us hear from the positive side first. I always like to start with the positives as a certain cushion if there's any negatives to come. What things did you like? Leaving now aside the content, let's first focus on the method of presentation, the method of delivery. Let's hear it from somebody. Yes? Good emphasis. What forms did you see the emphasis in?
Stressing individual words, drawing them out.
There was a certain stress on individual words, yes. In certain cases, right where you wanted a stress, there was. In other cases, I may say I would have wanted to slow down much more, but that will get into broader questions of pace and content. But if we take emphasis in a narrower rhetorical sense of stressing specific words, I remember when Ms. Ciccadella said values, and she stressed the word values, so that would be an example. Starting from the beginning, what was the good thing about this from the outset in terms of the introduction of the whole talk? Yes?
Very vivid example.
Vivid examples to establish what? What was her purpose in bringing in, what were those examples, nailing the body to the Volkswagen or the fish to the piano? Yes?
Motivation.
Yes, she obviously was on the premise of motivating the audience. And that's a very reasonable motivation if you assume a decent audience, that they see this horrible stuff today and they need something from art. They're obviously not getting it. What would they want in its place? That may be a way of intriguing them. That was your intention, right? To let them see that they're missing something and you're going to supply the void. So your intention there was to hook, whet their appetite. How many think, speaking now as an outside audience, not as someone who knows where she's going or the importance of the subject, that the motivation would would work, would take for an audience? Let me see by your hand. How many think it would not? Well, if you think it would, presumably it's because of the vividness of the examples. If you think it wouldn't, on what grounds might you think it wouldn't take? Yes.
Strong sense that she was exaggerating, that she was exaggerating.
You say there's a sense that she was exaggerating by means of the extremity of the examples, you mean? Well, she did limit herself to very extreme examples. I'm not sure that's a valid audience because in their own, you might have countered your objection by just giving a one-sentence survey to indicate that this sort of thing, while extreme, does indicate the whole non-objective trend. But most people, if they reached the stage of coming to a talk called Defending Romanticism, would know what kind of stuff goes on today, and presumably they wouldn't be too sympathetic to it, so I don't think that per se is an objection. Did anybody else have any other objection as an introduction, as a motivation? I'm not saying it's not good, but is there any way that motivation could have been hyped up for the same price? Yes?
I think she could have paused a little bit and give the audience time to digest what she just said there.
Well, you mentioned pause, so we may as well jump right into that. You desperately needed pauses. Now, you wanted to be sure that you got in your timing, and you did it. You were, I think, about 40 seconds inside the time limit. And that is desirable, but it's much better not to do it by the method that you did, which is full speed ahead, non-stop. It's much better to pause and let something sink in, if you can. Did you have marked on your script points that you could omit?
No, I
See,
didn't.
you say no. You should always have a cushion, see, of points that you can dispense with. And if you feel as you're delivering a motivation, for instance, well, you need a beat for them to take it in that you didn't anticipate. You stop right there and just let them mentally digest it. And as they're thinking of it, you think, well, there goes point X. And you just let it go out. By that means, you keep a certain pace. Now, you had another problem with regard to pace that we'll get to, but one problem was that nonstop delivery. And I think you did undercut the motivation by not letting it sink in. It's a key thing that you want to let sink in. I was thinking something else by way of developing the motivation. Just one intellectual point to include that might have hyped up or increased the motivation would be if you told them there is a reason for this kind of art. There once was a different kind of art as a result of two different kinds of philosophy that dominated the world. I want to tell you what an alternative would be and what it depended on, and then you'll see why today's has come to be what it is. If people don't get the idea that there is some deeper significance to it, that there is some basic issue involved, then they can hear you as, well, she doesn't like this kind of stuff, and I don't either, but it's all a matter of taste, you see. And there's no disputing about taste. It leaves a certain subjective cast, not by what you said, but by the cultural implication that aesthetics is simply completely subjective and arbitrary. So if ever I'm discussing aesthetics, I'd want to stress there is a right and a wrong answer. It depends on the kind of philosophy you hold. We see this stuff today because of a certain kind of philosophy. There once was a different one. You see what I mean? And that way, you derail it from the subjective track in the audience's mind onto a cognitive track. Then they think there may be something to learn. There may be some objective points here. You see, even if they don't agree, they go on the premise of listening rather than, well, it's her taste, my taste, nobody can know, and it's all a matter of opinion. In art, it's important to counter that at the outset. But I do think you did definitely intend a good motivational approach, and that could work with just a little, you know, of this other element injected. What else was good about this presentation? Yes?
Well, I thought that another way in which she was motivating the audience was to pick on what things are most people like to go see. In other words, bring up the movies, bring up adventure.
Yes, there was a virtue and a vice in that. You say she was motivating by bringing up the kind of things the audience wanted to see and hear. And that's true. That's intrinsic in her motivational approach. You're sick of what you see today. I'm going to show you that there's something better, and you know yourself what kind of things you like to go to. But there's a question, how much can you bring up in 10 minutes and explain? We'll get to that in a moment. But simply, the intention of appealing to what an audience likes, I agree to. How would you estimate the talk from the point of view of monitoring the audience? Did you feel she was attentive to your requirements, or did you feel she more or less had it prepared and she was going to deliver it no matter what you did? How many felt that she was the second? I see a lot of people nodding. Yes, you definitely, and you raised your hand yourself, right? You definitely, you had that very thoroughly prepared. I did not notice any stumbling or circling. You went ahead like a speeding truck, and that definitely detracts from any extemporaneous presentation because you leave the audience out of it. They don't have time to digest it or question it. You don't tailor your presentation to what they see. So you achieve safety at the price of that canned quality, you see, which I'm trying to urge you not to do, to just take the risk of giving it and falling flat and not being that prepared. And you would find probably that you would stumble. It would be a more agonizing experience for you, but more interesting to the audience. And not simply because they're sadistic. You were definitely good as far as the level of volume. That was good. You could be heard. You had a brisk delivery. You made a few stabs at a kind of humor, and it wasn't obtrusive, but it was enough to give you a little titter, which just kind of eased you over an edge here or there. Your sentence structure and vocabulary was simple. I could definitely have done with more repetition, but that'll get me to my major problem with it. Now, before I get to what I would say, what would you say is the major or a major problem with this talk? Now, those of you who thought it was essentially positive may not think there was one, but I think I could show that there was a certain major problem running throughout this. Now, let me take somebody whom I haven't called you. Yes, okay.
Crow, delimitation.
The crow. Delimitation, absolutely right. There was too much, I mean, you can word this point in different ways, but there was definitely more material than could possibly be grasped in a process of 10 minutes. Now, I see from the several talks that we had last time and this time that this is a common denominator. You have to overcome the idea that because something is clear to you, you can just rattle off an enormous content to an audience that doesn't know it, and they will be able to understand it. You have to, the essence of objectivity, of a self-contained presentation, and of the crow, of all those points in this context is, you have to figure out how much they need to grasp a given point. Now, your main problem throughout was giving them points, any one of which could be grasped if you paused for a minute, repeated, gave an example, gave a contrast, summarized it, and then said, okay, hold that, let's go on. But if you just give us one after the other, and I take it that we don't already know the points, it is not graspable. It's too abstract without examples, and it's simply too fast to know what to do with. You have no way of assessing. Now, who can give me examples of that? I copied down a number, but it was true really of all the major points in your paper. Again, it's like the papers we had last time. You have a choice in a limited time. And after all, even if you have a 2-hour talk, it's limited compared to what you could do in a 10-hour talk. You have to decide of two different strategies, a hit and run on a whole bunch of points, or more slowly and in depth on a few more essential points, and the second is always a preferable strategy. What I suggest you do as a general rule is make a list of all the points that you would like if you had lots of time on a given talk. Then cut out everything that you think is optional. Then look at what you have left, which you regard as indispensable, it's not optional, and estimate what reasonably each point would take in time to explain to a raw audience. And then multiply or add up the amount of times. And you will find, if you did that here, that you'll way exceed what could be done in 10 minutes. In which case, then, you simply have to be more ruthless. After you cut the flesh, you have to cut the bone, the vital organs. You have to cut. And the only way you can get around, even justify in your own mind, is this. If this was the last word, and the universe was coming to an end, your audience was all, I don't know, had terminal cancer, and they were going to hear this and then die, you could say, my God, I just have to cram it all in. But then, of course, they wouldn't do them too much good practically. But if they're going to be around, and they've agreed to come on a 10-minute talk or whatever it happens to be, they must know that you can't do the impossible. Therefore, the way to get around it is simply say, this talk would take hours to present. I'm going to give you a couple of highlights, which I'll try to explain, and I'll say a few things that I can't even explain, but you'll get the general drift, and then I refer you to so-and-so. That's it. That is a much better way than trying to do it when you can't. Now let's get examples. Where were there statements here that the statements per se were okay, but there was no time to digest, illustrate, elaborate, or develop? Yes, Harry.
Emotions come from values.
Yes, emotions come from values. Now, if you have to inject that topic, you're already lost, because that emotions come from intellectual content is already more controversial than Romanticism versus naturalism. And the audience, almost any audience, is going to be more interested in that. And they're going to say, well, emotions, by values, you understand, you mean some intellectual conclusion that you've come to, as opposed to being caused by social conditioning or your heredity or genes or glands or whichever. Or as opposed to simply being inexplicable primaries that no one can explain. Now that in itself is a very revolutionary theory. You cannot take a theory like that and say, in order to discover what is emotionalism, let's realize, and you said, we in the 20th century have come to discover, that was your phrase, that emotions are rooted in values. Now, we in the 20th century, only a very small minority in the 20th century have discovered any such thing, because the great majority would say that's fantastic, and the major schools of psychology would agree with them absolutely, such as the Freudian or the behavioristic, etc. Now, why did you have any plausibility to that? Because you kept it very generalized. You didn't say that by value you mean an intellectual conclusion that the person reached. The result of that is people could say, well, I guess by value she merely means what you like and don't like, which is a synonym in effect for emotions. So they hear you as emotions come from emotions. Well, that's okay. Or some emotions come from other emotions. That's okay. They can, in other words, they can accept your point on emotions at the price of collapsing your next connection, because your next was going to be, but where do values come from? And then you go right to, well, if we can't choose, values are insignificant. Now, why is that? It's not very clear unless you can give some kind of elaboration, but if values are simply a name for certain kind of feelings, which is how your audience is hearing you, why do we have to choose them? Why can't you just be born and you grow up and develop and you start to feel titillated at certain points, you like certain things, you hate certain things, and that's it, that's the way you are. So where does choice come in? Now, you weren't too clear about that, because you said, I wish I could take shorthand, which I can, but you said, if you can't choose, there are no values. And then you amended that, I think, to say, if you can't choose, values are insignificant. And then you kind of paused as if you were going to make one more stab at it, and then you let it go, and you said, let's summarize. I believe I'm giving an accurate summary. In other words, you were not very clear, and you couldn't have been given your structure. Now, suppose values were conclusions that the mind came to. Why would they, in fact, require choice? Why couldn't there be such a thing as values which are determined, built into the mechanism? Why not? What would you say? Well, you say because man has free will, but you are trying to lead us back from emotions to values, as values necessitating free will. But why does it necessitate free will? You see, in other words, you're counting on this kind of contrast. If man was a helpless puppet, completely a product of factors outside of his control, then he would just be buffeted by fate, in which case he'd have no decisions to make, no choices to make, no goals to select, no values to choose, in which case then he would be indifferent, in effect, as against, and then the opposite. But you didn't have time to give us all this, and therefore by your statement it's so generalized and so vague that by the time you get to free will, it just kind of leaves us, she believes in free will, but why this is connected to emotions is completely unclear, which means your whole definition and defense is gone. Now, there were other cases of this. Who's had some other cases of the same general type of problem, that is, too much, attempt to cover too much and therefore being reduced to a very abstract floating presentation. At the very back with an orange, yes.
Determinism and free will. She didn't clearly define free will, although she made an attempt at defining determinism.
Well, he says you didn't really define free will. Now, whether that's a legitimate objection depends upon how much you can really expect to do. I grant you there's a certain problem here. If you're going to give the objectivist defense of Romanticism, the defense does depend on the fact that this is based on the true facts of human nature, namely free will, which is already a very wicked assignment because free will in itself would be a whole topic. So you'd have to cover that in a common sense way. But you would have to at least, I agree with the criticisms to this extent, you'd have to give one level of elaboration. Now, instead of me telling you, what could it be? Think right now. If you have to give to a raw audience one cursory elaboration of what you mean by free will, you haven't got time to say, by free will I mean the mind's power to think or not to think, because that'll raise 10,000 questions, and what do you mean by thinking, and you'll lose them all. But you want to simply not just say free will and let it go so fast that they don't know what it is. What would be a way of doing it briefly? Does anybody want to suggest, in effect, a sentence or so of how you could do that without raising a whole nest? Is that a hand or a light switch at the back? Yes, yes.
You might say, are you responsible for your own actions or something outside of you?
You suggest, could you say, are you responsible for your own actions or is something outside of you the cause of what you do? In other words, he's suggesting take some common terms which do apply to free will, but which people know. Don't just use the jargon term free will, you see, but say, are you the master of your fate? Are you a puppet pulled by destiny? Are you responsible for what you do? Do you select it? Or are you just dragged by forces beyond your control wearily to your fate with no say, no input, no choice, no control? You see, it doesn't take that much longer, but just by doing it, say, twice, in the kind of language, that people would recognize. It's obviously slanted language. A determinist will have apoplexy at hearing his position presented that way, but that's okay. You're presenting your view. You never said you're arguing against determinism here. You indicate, you see, what you're saying. And since it's so crucial to you, you repeat it. And that is also essential by emphasis, and you also include its opposite. I want to stress again, you cannot really make philosophic points clear except by contrast. You cannot make clear free will except by saying as against the view that such and such. You can't say emotions come from values, clear even, unless you say as against the view that they come from chemistry or from God or that they're inexplicable. You see, you have to always set a contrast. Philosophy is such broad abstractions that one absolutely indispensable way of clarification in writing or in speech is to say, I mean this as against this. In fact, if I were, in the light of some of the presentations, if I were redoing the theory, I think I would put contrast in as a separate principle in my presentation. So if you want to put that down as an item of pure theory of presentation, to make clear what you're talking about, you have to contrast your central ideas with their antonyms, with what they exclude, so people will know what you're saying as against what you're not. I can't stress that enough. Does anyone have, I don't want to go over, every element in your talk, but we could take every main point, if I could just reel off a couple more briefly, where I had the same type of problem. You said now at one point, now let us go into romanticism dissolving into irrationalism. And then you said, I want to say that reason has to be tied to reality. Now what, and then you said to reasonable premises. Now what questions would that raise? What issue are you trying to cover in that brief aside? That you're saying reason has to be tied to reality. You're trying to exclude from romanticism what type of view?
Escapism.
Escapism. You're trying to say, in effect, if somebody sets something in a fantasy world, that's not romanticism. But isn't it? Is romanticism exclusively what Ms. Rand calls romantic realism? It isn't. Romanticism is a very, very broad category. And you can be wildly irrational and still be a complete romanticist in art. In fact, this was true of a great many of the leading romanticists. Dostoevsky is hardly, for instance, an apostle of reason. He's an ardent Russian Orthodox religious maniac in terms of the content of his views, you see. The values that he espouses are completely severed from reality by his own statement, to take just that example. Therefore, you mustn't restrict romanticism to one particular philosophic interpretation of it. It's a much broader category. On the other hand, what you wanted to do is cover the philosophic point. You were trying to say, don't think that because I'm for emotion, therefore I'm against reason, right? Now, what got you into that problem? What made you feel, well, I have to clarify that I'm not really against reason? There was something in your original presentation that left that question open, which would make you feel I have to somehow or other come out and clarify this point. What was does anybody recognize the point that was made early in the presentation about traditional romanticism, and the speaker said, what then happened to it? Now, what explanation did you give? Do you remember what explanation did you give when you said Schiller and Hugo were emotional?
I said that emotion increased and it got carried away and so on. But
Yes.
eventually it lost.
You said their emotion, if I copied it down approximately correctly, their emotion became so strong that eventually it became irrational. Now, I grant you that in oral presentation, you can't be held to exact wording, but that one is pretty extreme because even if we don't, pick on every word, what obvious implication is suggested in that? That your emotion up to a point is okay, but emotions are in effect what philosopher would be quite prepared to accept that particular formulation. Not that you agree with them, but simply by inadvertency. What philosopher would take that formulation? That emotions are like a roaring beast within you, and up to a point they're okay, but it's ready to spring and take over and topple the reason. That was Plato's view, and that is generally a view of emotions as non-rational, not to say irrational elements in the personality. Well, here you're taking a topic now, I see, of romanticism, which in most people's minds, if they know anything about it, is associated with strong feeling, emotion, passion. And it's for that reason, plus that it's in art, they have two different reasons in the cultural context to want to associate romanticism with irrationalism, because it's emotion and because it's art, you see. So if you know that context, the first thing you have to think is that I have to defend romanticism. I got to somehow avoid my audience deciding this is going to be completely irrational. And that's going to be tricky because I can't go into what emotions are, and I can't go into that art is really rational, because both of those are more controversial than romanticism. But instead of that, you fell right into it at the beginning by confirming their original. You see, what they would come to the talk with, they would say, yes, that's right, when emotions get too strong, they become irrational. And then the next step will be, well, then modern art is really a continuation of Romanticism, because they got so emotional that they went over into the non-objective and the fish on the piano, which is what he felt like doing. It's completely irrational, but we already were told that emotions lead you to irrationality, and we know that, so what is really the difference? And then you say, well, free will. And they say, well, he had free will whether to put the fish on the piano or not. You just lose them completely. You see what I mean? Now, somebody here had a, yes?
Yeah. She didn't define Romanticism or naturalism, and just going by the content of what she said, I felt there was a strong implication that she was saying Romanticism is good regardless, and naturalism is bad regardless, and what bothers me is it would eliminate someone like Wyatt, who was very natural.
All right, let's just take,
very good.
Not too long, because I can't retain that much. Let's take your first point, where you said she didn't define Romanticism. Well, that isn't really true. She tried to define a certain category of what was Romanticism, what it was based on, and how it would manifest itself. So I don't think it's valid to say that she didn't define it, but you could say this about the definition, which would be the same as with the other points. You tried to take in so much territory that you necessarily had to leave it unclear. Why is that? By the fact of your putting in Cyrano, Tchaikovsky, Rodin, all in one shot, and then you brought in later movies and Hitchcock and whatever. But take just those three. What is the problem if you try to introduce Romanticism, including sculpture, painting, literature, music, all of it at one time? Now, true, the term does apply to all of them, but there's one very enormous problem with including them all. The advantage you get is the big spread. They see the total range. If they're not interested in literature, well, you're giving them music, and so you're motivating them, but you can't do it. And why is that? What is it about trying to do all that that defeats you? Does anybody know? Yes?
Well, it seems to me the superficial and secondary differences are so outstanding that the essential is very hard to identify.
Well, you say the differences are so outstanding, the essential is hard to identify. That's true, of course, but that is partly because in some of these cases, they're extremely treacherous to identify in their own terms. You remember, Romanticism is a specific category. So if you wanted to take Romanticism in sculpture, you could not equate it with any type of sculpture which is heroic, which gives you a man the conqueror or whichever. I don't know, I don't want to go into this now, but you've probably heard Miss Rand explaining why she does not regard Greek sculpture, although she admires it, as romantic. And therefore, Romanticism is a much more specific term, standing for a very definite art school. But by putting in heroic sculpture without further definition, and then if we throw in on top of that music. Now, the problem with proving anything in music is what one thing that Ms. Rand has pointed out. I always stay away from music like the plague, not because I don't like music, but I mean in lecturing about it. The problem with music is what, if you've read her work? There is no objective vocabulary worked out. And therefore, you say you hear the swell of aspiration, and somebody else says, well, that's just what I hear when I hear some modern stuff, or disco music. They say, I hear the pulsing beat of the man of achievement, So you see, you can't say those things are self-evident. In literature is the easiest art to discuss because it's a conceptual art. It's actually expressed in words, you see. And therefore, you can identify what is the person after, what is the message, what are the means. Painting, the visual arts are much harder to do unless you have slides and a really excellent knowledge of the field of how to point out what a given piece of sculpture means, for instance, and what about it conveys that meaning. I've seen that done. If you heard the lectures many years ago by Marianne serious. She was brilliant at that, but she was a real authority at that. Music is virtually impossible to do as far as I know, except perhaps in extreme cases, where you could take Arnold Schoenberg versus Tchaikovsky. I would say, if you don't see that, that's self-evident, and I'm not arguing about that. But the way you did it, with that combination, all that comes across as a very generalized, something aspiring or something positive. But because it's so generalized, it could apply to anything the viewer or the listener happened to like, your audience happened to like. And therefore, at the end of the talk, all he knows is, well, you want the kind of art that's going to, in effect, make you feel good. But he wants that too. But what does it specifically consist of? You see, you fell down in explaining that, partly because you set your scope of examples too broad, and partly because you put in too much theory. Now, I don't want to hammer home more points on this, but the overall, let me just take, I think this is, I made a note here, somewhat breathless in delivery, but I think that's because the sheer weight of what you had to put out here was so enormous that you would have to have felt an enormous inner pressure to get all this out with the clock going around. So I think, if I would summarize, I think that you're basically off with regard to what was the first suggestion made, the Crow epistemology. That's the broadest way, and then more specifically, it's the issue of pace again. Too much material attempted in a space where you can't do it. So I would, to give my own estimate, I'd have to say essentially positive in delivery, in your method of delivery, with the one exception that I would like you to have monitored more. Even if you have to fake it, just to give the audience the sense that you're actually listening to them. So you could pause for a minute and say, did you get that? And then go on, see. Just to bring them into it so they don't feel it's all preset. But other than that, your delivery was loud, lively, and okay. But I'd have to give you a negative, if you'll forgive me, in the content, because I think you lost the essential points in the torrent that you gave us. So I hope that doesn't discourage you, and I thank you very much for trying what truly was an impossible assignment. I was trying to think to myself, if I were going to do that assignment, I had 10 minutes, and I had to motivate them on top of it, I'd tear my hair out at the outset. But I think all I would attempt to do in a case like that is say, this is a very broad school. It's completely opposed to anything you know about from today. It's, let's take just an example of it from a couple of plays, that's it. And the general application to other things I have to leave for another time. And I think I would cover, let us say, one or two plays, but from the aspect specifically of something like plot and characterization. Because that's what gives the real content, you see. If you simply say aspiration and the positive and refueling, they can take it to mean anything. But if you say certain progression of events as against what you see today, certain type of character, they get a more specific idea. And the whole thing here is to try to specify within a delimited time. Even so, I would be very doubtful that I could do it, so don't feel badly, because it really was a murderous assignment. But you were helpful to us because you gave us an idea. What complexity you have to choose from in order to undertake that. All right, we are now going to turn to the last of the volunteers in the subject of oral presentation, Miss Jean Joyner. She is going to speak again to a general audience who does not know philosophy or objectivism. She is going to speak on the subject, the sanction of the victim. Miss Joyner, just come up, take your time till you feel you're ready.
Thank you. As Dr. Peikoff has already told you, my topic tonight is the sanction of the victim. It is a phenomenon identified and defined by novelist Ayn Rand. My purpose is to present an overview of this concept. I think a good example of the sanction of the victim occurs in the TV movie Holocaust. There is a scene early in the movie where a Jewish family is sitting around the dinner table. They're discussing the way things are going in Germany. They're not going too well. Hitler is newly in power. He's already restricting the privacy and infringing on the possessions and other rights of the Jewish people. The father, who is a doctor, is arguing that the family should leave Germany as soon as possible, that things can only get worse. The mother, however, has a deep love for Germany. It is her homeland, and she argues against this. Her arguments basically run like this. This is my home. Germany has a cultural heritage that has made it the greatest country in the world, and we cannot abandon it. The father, unforgivably, agrees, and they stay. Well, the movie progresses several days, several hours later. You see the family again. Two of the children have been executed, and the mother and father are in a death camp awaiting their own execution. The mother is very well aware of her responsibility here. The father still is saying, there's nothing we could have done, it's okay. He's the one who started out saying, we must change this. This example leads right into my definition of sanction of the victim. Broadly, I define it to mean a situation occurring when a man or woman facing a decision of importance to his life evades the responsibility to consider all of the factors available, or he refuses to make the decision at all. The events resulting from this default lead to a personal disaster. Who are sanctioning victims then? I would say that it is anyone who ignores the smallest to the largest personal decisions affecting his life. I saw a TV show this morning that was a really graphic illustration. It was the Phil Donahue show. On the TV show were two financial analysts, fairly well known, who were talking about whether or not we're going to have a depression, how to protect yourself against inflation, how to protect your savings, how to protect your dollar. Is Social Security going to hold out? Will your parents go broke? Will they starve? Issues like this. And they were suggesting methods which include taking your money out of banks, to buying Krugerrands, whatever you need to do to protect yourself at this point. Okay, well, obviously they are assuming the worst. They say it is necessary to assume the worst. Well, obviously these are important issues. The audience was attentive. The unforgivable thing that happened here was in the person of Phil Donahue. He attacked these two men as though they were anti-American. He even said, how dare you even bring up issues like this and challenge a system like this that has been successful for so long. Aren't you going against mom and apple pie? He even said those things. Okay. Well, Phil Donahue has a habit of trying to intimidate his guests. Usually his audience goes along with him. This time they didn't. The issues were too important. I really can't say much more about this subject except to say that Things are so important now, and there are so many dangers facing us that we cannot afford not to see, we cannot afford not to decide. We can't be an ostrich. We can't shove our head into a book or whatever and just not look at the issues that are crucial now. We can't draw lines. We can't say, well, I'll make decisions on this, but not on this. This is okay. I'm moral here, I'm ethical here, I'm willing to think through the important issues of my life here, but this is a little too difficult for me. I would just say that the answer is to never evade the responsibility of deciding. Because if you do, somebody else will decide for you. And I think that the history of the world today, to date, has shown that we really can't rely on anybody else. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Ms. Joyner. All right, let us now take a survey of your view of this. Giving you a choice again of 3 overall assessments, how many would say essentially positive? A smaller number. How many would say essentially mixed? A larger number. How many would say essentially negative? Well, I guess it approximately divides into thirds. Where are you? You're over there, right? Okay. Let me hear from the positives first, and I'll give my own view at the end. Yes?
It was a comfortable pace. It seemed to be a good feeling. It seemed to be sincere.
You just say there was a comfortable pace, and you added there's a good feeling and it's sincere. That's not exactly the same point, but taking one point at a time. The pace, you didn't feel you had too much material to deal with, and I would agree with that. In this event, you could make the opposite objection, which is what? That there was not enough material, and you even actually ran out of time. That is to say, you ran out of material before your time was allotted. You could have put more in this. That is not my central objection, but it was somewhat thin. Now, see, you were leaving, as far as I could see, a cushion to elaborate because you were definitely going to do it extemporaneously. But that's why I tell you that you have to be prepared for it to go in 2 different directions. Because on the one hand, it goes slower than you think, so you have to cut. On the other hand, you suddenly realize I'm running out, it's only 5 minutes. If you have an extra point on the side that you think is significant, you weren't expecting to give it, but it's there in case, then that allays your problem and you can turn to that. So you, in effect, underestimated the amount of material you could cover. And there's a reason for that, which I'll explain in a moment. But I think the net effect is you had no problem with pace, but you had no problem because you didn't really do justice to the subject even within the framework of 10 minutes. But what else was positive? I would like to make a compliment to Ms. Joyner, since I'm going to make a number of negatives, which is I think you did a very good thing, which is the only way that you can learn in this field, and that is you were obviously nervous at the outset. And I could see there, you know, from the way you tripped over a word here and there, and I could see the way you made the mental resolve you're going to continue this and not let that rising sense of panic and out of control take over. And you swallowed once or twice, and you kept on going, and you did get into a better control. And I think you see, having done it, it wasn't as horrifying as in prospect it seems to be. And, you know, after 2, 3, 4 times, if you wanted to, you have the ability to get up and speak straightforward. I think he's right when he said you spoke sincerely. You didn't rattle it off. You did, you know, you said, I liked, for instance, when you said, I heard the Donahue show this morning, and that was obviously something that was spontaneous, that wasn't written out. Well, we wouldn't think you'd have time to write it out from just this morning, and it did give an extemporaneous quality to the presentation. So I think that is true, that you have a nice manner and you have definitely the means to overcome your nervousness if you give yourself more practice. Who else has something positive to say? At the back, yes. Yes.
Well, I think that she gave her examples were quite elaborate and they were clear, they were dramatic, they struck home to the heart.
Well, you say her examples were clear, dramatic, elaborate, and struck home to the heart. I think that the examples were all the things you say with only one problem. There's only one objection I had to the examples. This was definitely not a paper of floating abstractions, because she started with a very clear example and she gave another one, so you know exactly what she meant. She did communicate the idea that she wanted. The only objection I have is one, but it's a very essential objection, and it therefore includes the choice of the examples. So if we go to the negative for a moment, what would be a central objection to this presentation? There's one overwhelming one, so if you don't give me the right one, I'm going to just take the prerogative of ignoring what you suggest, because my objection supersedes any other one. Yes, in the red.
I thought they were too elaborate. You got terribly distracted from what the main point.
Well, yours is not the same objection I have in mind. You say you thought the objections were too elaborate. You got distracted from the main point. I didn't find that. I thought the examples were very clear. I know exactly what she intends by those examples. I think she made them clear. They were pretty long for a 10-minute presentation, but I didn't myself find it distracting. I had a entirely different type of objection. I'm trying to get somebody different. Yes, Ms. Stevens. Yes, I think that the main objection is just what was said. I'll repeat that. She said she did not speak about the sanction of the victim. In other words, you gave a moral principle, but not the one that was intended by the expression of the sanction of the victim. Therefore, your talk was off in its essential content. Now, let me try and elaborate that. What did you define? So we have to here distinguish between the method of presentation and your understanding of the particular point, because if your understanding of the main point was off, then of course we have to distinguish that. That's a content issue. So I hope you won't think this is too harsh, but I think your presentation was essentially wrong of what does the sanction of the victim mean. You interpreted that both by your examples and by your formal statement as a person who either evades the responsibility to consider all the factors in making a decision or refuses to make any decision at all in a moral issue, or in a case where a decision is required. And then you gave two examples, in effect, of the ostrich, as you presented it, the ostrich approach. That is, something negative is taking place and the person simply didn't want to see and turn away and pretended, well, the threat isn't so bad. It's not going to happen. You gave the Jews in Germany and the Donahue in regard to inflation, right? So what did you interpret the sanction of the victim as being then? In effect, putting your head in the sand and the Pollyanna approach. Everything will work out okay and I don't have to face brutal realities. Now that is per se not the distinctive to objectivism, nor is that what is meant specifically by the sanction of the victim. Now how would you apply the term sanction of the victim on that broad sense? You mean they're the victim of their own behavior? Is that it? They're producing their own destruction, but then you're making the sanction of the victim the equivalent of any policy which leads to self-destruction. You're saying, in effect, go ahead.
I was trying to make it the equivalent of any policy of default that leads to self-destruction.
Well, you make it any policy of default which leads to self-destruction. That is going to amount to a synonym for any kind of immorality. Any kind of immorality, because the objectivist view of virtue is whether you think or not. And the only form of vice that there is, abstractly, is the default on thinking, the refusal to think, evasion or whichever, which would result in leading to your own harm in one way or another. Therefore, you're making this, within the objectivist framework, coextensive with vice, in effect, with evasion or mental or intellectual default. But you see, that is much, much too broad. For one thing, if you remember, Reardon in Atlas Shrugged is the arch example on which this concept is presented and defined. And he is regarded and presented throughout the novel as a very moral, highly moral man. In no way does he evade the responsibility to consider all the factors. He's extremely conscientious. He doesn't refuse to make decisions. He does one wrong thing, a very wrong thing unknowingly, which results in him being a victim and in him endorsing or sanctioning it. But it's absolutely not the category of thing that you describe here, and yet that is the arch, what they call the classical locus, the primary source from which the concept was defined was Reardon. So if we're talking about the sanction of the victim, if you use it in that broader sense, you see, like this, any time you are a victim in the sense of harmed by policies that you yourself initiate, you're using it in so broad a sense that it doesn't stand for the specific concept, you see. Now let us, what more narrowly, I don't want to make this a lecture on morality, but what more narrowly and specifically is the sanction of the victim as opposed to simply a generalized immorality or refusal to face facts, which are very, very broad generalities. But this is a very specific type of error, which, as Miss Rand presents it, can be moral or immoral. That is, can be honest and innocent, a la Reardon, or can be dishonest. You can be the victim either way, honestly or dishonestly. But what does she, what is the abstract definition that encompasses this narrower usage? Not simply the very broad sense. All right, at the back in a red shirt. When you help or cooperate what? When you help or cooperate with those who are trying to destroy you, but specifically the word sanction is very important here. I want to elaborate this. So I know your hand is up. If I get to it, I will, but I've taken it into account. When you specifically sanction, condone, or approve morally those who are trying to destroy you, now that, and thereby become, give the sanction to your destroyer and become, therefore, the victim sanctioning his killer. Now, but that has to be understood more specifically than simply, you didn't run from your killer out of fear or out of wishful thinking. If somebody says he's going to hold a gun on you and you say, I don't believe it, you're really a nice guy, you wouldn't do that. That is not the sanction of the victim. You are being led to your own destruction, in this case, let us say, through honest ignorance, or maybe through being a Pollyanna, but that is not saying, I approve of my murder and I'm going to cooperate with you as you cut me down. The sanction of the victim is specifically morally endorsing the policies of your destroyers. Now, in the case of the example from Germany, it would be, for instance, if one of Hitler's victims were to say, Hitler is a great man. Who am I to judge? He says we should sacrifice for the state. I agree that that is noble. We should sacrifice for the state. He must know what's right. I don't want to antagonize people around me. I'll vote for Hitler. I'm sure he'll mellow when he gets into office, and so on and so on. Now, that is the pure sanction of the victim. In this case, by plain appeasement, cowardice, or whichever. That is not the same thing as saying, it won't happen here, I can't believe it. Now, a person might think it won't happen here for a number of different reasons. That's not necessarily that it's happening. He sees it's happening, and he says, that's fine with me. Now, do you get that? It's a very crucial distinction. The clearest example is in the innocent case. Now, for instance, Reardon was a victim of Lillian and of his whole family throughout the book. They denounced him, they exploited him, they cursed him, etc. He did everything he could to exonerate them. He took all the abuse, he took the exploitation, he took the condemnation and the loneliness, and he would try to stretch his mind to give them the benefit of the doubt. Not dishonestly, mind you, but say, well, they couldn't have meant this. I can't believe this bad of them. They had something better in them once, and it was, in effect, his innocence. Not his desire to evade, but his innocence, his generosity, his attempt to bend over backwards in being fair made him agree to stay and approve a whole group who were systematically wrecking him. You see, and when he discovered at the end what was happening, then he turned with a vengeance and he cut them off. Now he discovered that he had been engaging in the sanction of the victim, you see. So he was doing it innocently, but nevertheless he was doing it. So if you wanted to present this to an audience, the crucial thing I'd have to stress to you, if we make a more abstract point than simply your particular mistake, when you deal with abstractions, be sure you pitch them at the right level. Don't be so generalized in dealing with abstractions that you lose the specific topic you're after. Now, there's a certain common denominator between the two presentations, which is taking an abstract issue and pitching it so abstractly that you lose your actual content. That is, one presentation presented Romanticism so broadly as to include, in effect, by implication, anything positive in art. And you presented the sanction of the victim in such general terms that it was any form, in effect, of evasion or default. Whereas, in fact, Romanticism is a specific school and the sanction of the victim is a specific error. And actually what Ms. Rand wanted to show in discussing in the sanction of the victim principle is why you have to think in terms of moral principles, and why, if you're ignorant of moral principles, you leave yourself open to be destroyed by people without even knowing what's going on. But not to go into a lecture on the sanction of the victim. You can check that in Atlas if you want. What I see as the common denominator here in presenting the intellectual content is be sure that you make your points specific so that enough to cover the specific topic that you're covering. If it's Romanticism, it can't be synonymous with all good art. And if it's a sanction of the victim, it's not synonymous with all morality. So what you should do to avoid this when you're starting your topic is ask, within what category does it fall? And then check your presentation. Are there other members of this category? In the same way, if you define table, you'd say it's a type of furniture. You'd know right away there's another types of furniture. Well, if you do Romanticism, you say it's a type of art and there's other types. It's a type of good art and there's other types. And the same way with the sanction of the victim. It's a type of impropriety, but there's many other types, you see. And before you present it, therefore, be sure you delimit it in your own mind. You narrow it down so that you don't lose the concept. And for that reason, I'd have to say a negative verdict because you lost the essential point. But I do think that your idea of examples were fine. If your intention were to illustrate the point that you mentioned, then you did give very good examples of putting your head in the sand. And so you did clearly illustrate it. And in that sense, I think the examples were dramatic. I have one question about, though, the German example. This is an issue of objectivity. I would never have used that particular example. For what reason? The one of the Jews in Germany. It did make your point of, not of the sanction of the victim, but of, putting your head in the sand. I wouldn't myself have used that example. For what reason? It would be an issue of objectivity only. I wouldn't even necessarily say that it was wrong. I simply would say, you remember you're talking to a complete outside audience, right? What possible misinterpretation in today's world do you want to stand on your head to avoid giving? In today's world, remember you're being identified as a conservative, and a conservative by your audience, and a conservative is regarded as generally what? By non-conservative circles, that is. as some kind of crackpot, some kind of religionist, some kind of racist or anti-Semite or whichever. That is the party line, so to speak. Now, if you have enough time to make clear that you're an individualist and you're in no way a racist, then you can use any examples you want. But if you have to do a tricky example, of which there are millions, and you pick on the Jews in Germany, it leaves an undesirable aftertaste, because the question in anybody's mind would be, why that example? Well, you happen to see the TV show, and you told us that. But on the other hand, you could read the newspaper, and you could see many more examples on the front page of non-Jewish businessmen appeasing, going to work for Senator Kennedy, right out of Mobil Oil, going to work for Senator Kennedy. And there's the classic example of all time of the sanction of the victim. The head of the PR for Mobil Oil took a temporary leave of absence in order to go to work for Senator Kennedy, who is out to destroy Mobil Oil. Now, you can't beat that. You couldn't make that up in fiction, and once it takes place, it finishes the subject. You have to use that as an example if you know it. But I'm simply saying, I'm very wary of any examples that could be interpreted as racist, anti-Semitic, anti-black, anti-any minority, because it's a touchy, sensitive issue, and people don't know what to expect on those questions. There's an additional thing. It is certainly true that there were a lot of Jews in Germany who engaged in wishful thinking, but it was absolutely not distinctive to them. There's no, if you're going to take the historical facts, there were a great many, full-blooded Aryans who were engaged in wishful thinking. There were every kind of Protestant and Catholic endorsing Hitler and saying it can't happen here, etc. So it's in no way distinctive to a minority, you see, and therefore there's no reason to pitch the example in a way to suggest a minority, because it just suggests a historical falsification. I was even more worried, because I thought you were going to take the example of the death marches at Auschwitz as an example of the sanction of the victim, which would really have been completely wrong. You didn't do it, so I won't criticize you for doing it. But just in case anybody thought of that example, you see, you understand that in the case of the death marches, those people were completely destroyed spiritually, tortured, disoriented, everything else. By the time they took place, you could not possibly apply any critical concepts to them, such as cowardly or sanctioning the victim or whichever. They were completely beyond the pale of those concepts, and it would be very wrong and immoral to evaluate them as though they had choice and were in control in a situation where they were already completely destroyed. You didn't say that, but you see, my train of thought was, as soon as you say Jews in Germany, sanction of the victim, you go right to the extreme, you see. And for that reason also, I never would come near that example in this kind of context. One other point. If you're discussing a sanction of the victim, wouldn't you have to cover, in order to clarify your point, is it a sanction of the victim to pay your taxes? To obey laws which are harmful to you? For instance, if you're in business and you're required by the antitrust to divest yourself of certain companies or to give away your patents to your competitors, and you agree to do it, is that the sanction of the victim? Now, it's very important, if you're giving this talk to an audience in a mixed economy, even assuming, that you did give the actual content of the sanction of the victim, it would be urgent that you put this clarification in. Because otherwise, what immediate thought will be in your audience's mind? Well, you shouldn't give a sanction if you're the victim and the taxes victimize me, for instance, to take that example, therefore I shouldn't pay taxes. And therefore I should go on revolt, refuse to pay, and spend my life in jail, and that's the objective's viewpoint. Now, that is obviously not the objective's viewpoint. Why not? Why is that not the sanction of the victim? Let's by a show of hands, who would, on the aisle at the back, yes. You say you don't accept the government's premise. Since you have no choice, since you're under force, no sanction is involved on your part. You're simply complying with physical threat out of simple self-preservation, and you know the point that morality ends where a gun begins. But you see, in an objective presentation of this topic, if you had only 2 minutes, you'd have to give 30 seconds to this because it's too easily misunderstood by an audience who will think in those broad terms, you shouldn't cooperate with your killers, therefore I won't pay taxes. You see, you'd have to make that clarification. I see you didn't have that problem because you pitched it on such a level of generality that no one would make that interpretation, but you made it simply synonymous with, you in effect took the teeth out of it, you see, because you simply made it synonymous with pay attention to what's going on and don't evade unpleasant decisions. Well, on that level, it's uncontroversial, but it's too conventional, you see. You could say that on just about any theory of ethics, and the question will be, what is moral and immoral that you didn't tell us? You just said, do the right thing. So it came out as too generalized. Okay, let us take a short break here, and then I want to take up the exercises that we have remaining on the sheets. All right, ladies and gentlemen. I want to begin by taking up the 3 last exercises that we had on the sheets that were handed out. I'm starting on page 7, number K. I will give you a moment to scan that. This, if you remember, was on objective presentation. And take a quick look at K and see, remind yourself what that's in. All right, not go any further. Let's hear from someone. What would you say? How many are convinced by this argument? Now remember, the writer may be present, so I don't mean that in a way to elicit a laugh. I just meant factually, how many are convinced? How many are not convinced? Well, what is wrong, in a friendly spirit now, with this argument? Who wants to make a suggestion? Yes.
Well, he's actually dealing with 2 things. One is whether an attack on females implies an attack on males, and then he spends 3 paragraphs about that, and then concludes that the motive of these attacks is really to attack males.
All right, so you say there's a switch here between whether an attack on females implies an attack on males and whether that's the motive of the attack. And there certainly is a distinction between the 2 things. Obviously, if I attack any group of human beings in a way which implies that free will doesn't exist, then by implication, that would be a slur on all human beings because it would imply that all of them are deterministic. But this is not simply to say that by indirect implication it's an affront to all of mankind. It's worded in such a way as to suggest that the fact the last sentence is the actual purpose of the attacks on the female is not to get rid of the female or to attack the female, but to attack the male. Now that makes it not simply a matter of broad philosophic implication, but of deliberate intent. Now if that's the intent, if that is the nature of the argument, what then is the objections to what is being said? Why doesn't it hold? Why don't these 2 paragraphs, the second and third paragraph, prove that fact? Because in each case, he says, they show the female does such, and that leads to such and such a negative about the man. Trying to get somebody different. Yes. You say it doesn't show in either case that it's something negative about the man. Why not? You say it just asserts it, but it supposedly deduces. For instance, take the second paragraph. If all females are treacherous, then the writer says, well, what does it say about the man that loves them? And then his argument is, if a man loves something treacherous, he must be corrupt. If women are treacherous, then a man who loves a woman loves something treacherous. Therefore, if women are treacherous, men are corrupt. That is the clear-cut structure of this. Now, what fallacy is involved in that little capsule arguing? Yes. As definitely an example of rationalism. Clear example of rationalism because it's a deductive structure omitting one question only. Does that deduction correspond to the actual facts? Suppose it were true that all women are treacherous, to confine ourselves to that example. Would that show or even suggest that all men who love them are therefore self-destructive and corrupt? Absolutely not, because what else is compatible with, even if it were true that all women are treacherous, what else is compatible with that? Do the men know it? After all, judging other people's moral character is not a self-evidency. Maybe men are so innocent, so noble and pure a species they can't imagine the degree of corruption. Or maybe a man might think to himself, well, look, if that's the way women are metaphysically, it's a tough life. It's a difficult world, but I still have certain needs too, and after all, since she's human, however treacherous, she has to have something good, so I'll focus on the better thing, and what can I do? I mean, you could not, from an argument such as this, conclude that men are necessarily no good. Moreover, if your intention was to say men are really rotten, it is a very roundabout way of doing it to say women are really rotten. It is a deduction in a vacuum, you see. What it would mean, if you loved somebody treacherous, you'd have to be treacherous. And if you were treacherous, then you're no good. And therefore, if women, and that is purely a deduction in a vacuum. That's a little mini rationalism. Essentially the same type of comment would apply to the next paragraph. Just don't put it here. Why would it apply to the next paragraph? Does anybody see where? It's the same type of thing. The presence of a woman, you see that part of the sentence, is the cause of such behavior. In other words, women are responsible and men are helpless. Now, can you get from the woman is the cause of the behavior to men are therefore merely deterministic reactors? Does that follow? But what fallacy is that? That's equivocation, right? Woman is the cause in the sense of she necessitates a certain reaction, or woman is the cause in the sense of the stimulus or the object which evokes, in some cases, a reaction. And so there's a definite equivocation here, but the author, he is again intent on showing, if this, then this, if this, then this, therefore man is no good, and he's going to get through that deductive chain. So again, it's a rationalistic argument. All right, let's look at L. Just look at it briefly. All right, I'm not giving you time to read this at leisure because this is just to refresh your recollection. Let me see, by raising your hand, what do you think is wrong with this? How many find something wrong with this, and if so, what? Now, I know these are tricky to say, but try to volunteer if you can struggle to put it into words, even if you don't get it exactly right. Yes, on there. You say it's too abstract and it's not concretized. It certainly is very abstract, but per se, you couldn't say that that is an indictment, but it might give you a tip to something. I mean, he is here discussing free will, and it is from a very abstract discussion, but this wouldn't quite name exactly what is the trouble, although it is a lead to it. If you read something you think is very, very abstract, the next suggestion to you is, well, it kind of floats without being connected to reality. And then if you can see one further element in it, namely a step-by-step structure, that combination would right away tell you it is rationalism. Now here you have a definite structure. This couldn't be because this. If you say this, the answer would be this, and if this, then this, if this, then this, therefore this. Now that structure per se is okay if it's connected to reality, but if you combine a very abstract content with the deductive chain, then the chances are you have rationalism, and here you certainly do. Now why do I say deductive chain? Well, to begin with, from the very first sentence. What is the difference between saying the conceptual faculty cannot be deterministic and the conceptual faculty is not deterministic? Yes? No, cannot doesn't say assuming it is. It says it can't be. Oh, you say he's assuming it is. No, not necessarily. But what he is saying is, by implication, he's not content to say man does have free will. He's going to give a special proof to show that he has to have free will, and you can't get around the fact that he has free will, and it would be impossible not to have free will. Now you see the objectivist, the actual objectivist argument on this point is man does have free will, and ultimately that's an axiom, validated by the method that all axioms are. That is, direct perception and then an abstract statement of a self-evident truth, which you can demonstrate as at the primary, a precondition of all knowledge. And I go through that validation in my course on objectivism. But for here, I want to say simply, if you recall that discussion, or you know the objectivist literature, you know that we do not attempt to prove that there must be free will by a deductive chain because we regard it as an axiom. But now here's an attempt to prove it by a chain. And since it's an axiom, it can't be done, and therefore the chain floats. Now how does it? Well, let's follow. There's no way man could automatically conceptualize without some means because the field is too wide. If he were automatically programmed to form all the concepts possible, he would starve because everything would launch his brain into overdrive and he'd never have time to act. Well, if we're simply speculating aloud, we're just thinking, could he conceivably have be determined? And I'm not going to say it's an axiom. I'm going to follow this method of argument. What immediate thing would I then think of? You say, well, if he were programmed, he'd never have time to act, so he'd starve. Since I'm going to reorganize reality anyway and project whatever I want, what will I say to answer that? Yes? Right, we're going to program in an evaluation that if a thing interferes with life-sustaining functions, he shouldn't do it. Therefore, why not hypothesize man is automatically forced to conceptualize. He has no free will, but he won't do it if it interferes with his life because his system is such that simply his brain will lose interest. That's an evolutionary development, so that takes care of that. And now the next sentence, he couldn't be programmed only to think and act in a pro-life way because a concrete action that might be pro-life in one instance might not be in another. Well, true enough, what would we say to that? This is very special programming. The species, the members of the human race that couldn't discriminate the pro-life actions died out, so only the ones that have the really good discriminations remain. Then the writer says, there is no automatic way of thinking that could be programmed, because each man's conceptual experience will be different. Well, couldn't I say, every animal's perceptual experience will be different. And so if the fact of distinction, difference, means free will, all animals have free will. Every plant encounters, in some respects, a different environment. So if that proves free will, plants have free will. Now, you see, there is no argument here, actually, at all. But what it is simply a mental projection in a vacuum. If there were no free will, then this would have to be the case, and if this, then this, and if this, then this, all of it, ignoring the obvious answer, which is if we're going to make things up, we could make up an answer to that too. Now that is a rationalist approach, and I deliberately put two together so you'd see the different forms in which it takes. You have to become attuned to the combination of very abstract discussions with an appearance of a deductive structure, and the whole thing collapses when you say why at a crucial point. That is the infallible sign of rationalism. Now let us look at the last one, number M. Now this is longer, so I'll give you a second to, again, just skim it. All right. How many are convinced by this argument? Now here we have seemingly convincing argument to lead to the conclusion that morality has to start with what people actually want or desire. So this would then be a proof of subjectivism in ethics. Ethics has to begin with what people happen to want, period. There's no other possible way to start, and the writer has presumably proved it by saying there's three theoretical possibilities. 1 and 2 are out, so it has to be 3. If you can do that, you win. I mean, that's it. That's a valid argument. Now, how many are convinced by this argument? Well, if not, why not? What is the problem with this presentation? I'm giving the people at the back a chance to wave your hands if you want to get in on this. Yes, in the blue shirt.
Well, there's no definition to begin with of what a moral concept is. So
there's no definition of a moral concept. Is that, though, why is that required? Because he does go on in the second, in that paragraph and say, in effect by implication, a moral code is a set of rules to guide human actions. That's implicit on the very top of page 8. A set of rules to guide actions. So in effect, it's by implication it's defined. Isn't it?
yes, I see now.
So you're convinced now?
I'm not convinced.
No, okay.
Because
I will give somebody else a chance here. Yes, right in the front.
I thought that the main problem with this was that he assumes right off the beginning that morality is divorced from life, that a person could live and not have...
All right, very good. There is a certain problem, and it does assume right off the bat that there could be a society without moral concepts. That's certainly true. He says, let's assume it. Well, then by implication, if you could have a society without moral concepts, what would be the immediate question then? If so, then yes. Then morality is obviously not required to live. If you could have a society without moral concepts, which is what the assumption is here, then whatever else is true, and it does exist, morality is not a necessity of human existence. Once that's true, then it does come down to what are your choices. Morality is a useless luxury, or it's whatever you feel like arbitrarily, because reality doesn't require it. So the thing begins at the outset by conceding the whole issue of why morality is required. Now, what is then the error? However, it appears to be a very definite proof. It says you have three choices, and here's what's wrong with one, and here's what's wrong with the second. This, again, is rationalism. Correct. This is definitely rationalistic, and it's a clear example. There's a certain assumption, unknowingly granted in this case, that morality, in fact, is not necessary. And then within that framework, what are the possibilities? And then they're listed and refuted one at a time, and you're left with an unavoidable deductive conclusion. But the whole question is, where did this society come from? How could it exist? What kind of actions does it take? What does guide its actions? And by that means, you're going to find out either this is a self-destroying society, like Jonestown or some version of it, in which case it obviously needs some moral concepts to guide it to survive. Or it does survive, and it does survive because it follows certain rules, and by identifying them, you see what they are, you see. So in this case, you make a certain assumption which concedes the whole case, and then there's a deductive structure thereafter, but the whole structure already concedes the case, so it is definitely rationalistic. Okay, that completes our... Did I have a comment on this? Yes.
Isn't society itself a moral concept?
No. So you say, is society a moral concept? No. A moral concept is an evaluative concept of a special kind. Society is just a name for a group of people living in the same geographic area. That is, does not yet per se say they're good or bad or indicate how they act. That's not a moral concept. All right, now I have a huge number of written questions, some left over from last week and the week before, about which I want to say something, and some from this evening. So I'm just going to plunge in. I'm going to have to, because of the number, avoid answering questions that are purely philosophical and that did not pertain to the subject matter of the lectures. There's simply, I don't think, time. Given that Holocaust was the highest rated TV movie shown and seen by more people than any other, wouldn't it be very reasonable to use it as an example to motivate listeners, since the odds are extremely high that they would be familiar with it? On that ground, yes, absolutely. Other things being equal, if something is very widely known and interesting, better to use it. But that is not alone a decisive criterion. The most crucial thing about an example is that it isolates only the point that you want to illustrate. You do not want your example to be confusing. You don't want your example to raise questions over and above the issue you're trying to illustrate. Now, I first learned this when I wanted to exemplify certain principles. I remember I was teaching a logic class many, many years ago in a college, and I thought, well, instead of giving dry examples that simply illustrate like the appeal to authority or begging the question or whichever, I'll get some more colorful examples with political or moral content at the same time, so I can both give the example and raise an interesting point and make the class more interesting. And I soon found, for instance, I would give an example in which begging the question was illustrated on foreign aid, which I would say, you see the fallacy of using this as an argument for foreign aid, and everybody in the class would start arguing about foreign aid and entirely lose the point that I was trying to illustrate. And I discovered quickly, if you're going to give examples, your first example at minimum has to be stripped bare of anything but cognitive content. It can't raise any questions other than what you need to make the thing clear. Then you can give a little more interesting or controversial or whichever. But for the reason I mentioned, therefore, I would override the Holocaust example in this context. Does the victim in the sanction of the victim issue have to be consciously aware of his destroyer's immorality and identify his immoral actions? If not, what does he sanction? No, he certainly does not have to be aware that the destroyers are immoral. If he were and he was condoning it, he would be consciously condoning immorality, which would make him immoral. And the whole point is that there are some dishonest perpetrators of this point, but there are many honest victims who sanction their own destruction, of which Reardon is an example. What does he sanction? What he sanctions is their action of destroying him. He doesn't realize that what they're doing is evilly motivated and is leading to his destruction, if he's an honest man. He thinks he can take it. He doesn't know what he's dealing with. So he sanctions an action which in fact harms him without realizing the nature of the harm or of the perpetrators. Does this principle apply in the case where an industrialist identifies his destroyers, the government's policies, as wrong, knows that in the long run he will lose, but chooses to continue working because it's what he enjoys doing? It's a good question. The answer is no. That is not the sanction of the victim. If he says the government's policies are wrong, in the long run they're going to destroy me, but I'm going to continue working because this is what I enjoy doing, per se, that doesn't make it the sanction of the victim. For one thing, he's acting on an explicit moral identification. He's denying, in this example, he's denouncing the policies of the government. He's saying it's a destroyer. So he's not saying this is good. And for another thing, as it's set up, he's doing it in a situation where he has no choice. He's saying, in effect, I'm going to get as much pleasure out of life as I can get if he, on the side, fights the trend in whatever terms are open to him. If he doesn't appease, if he's not cowardly, he doesn't go out of his way to get government favors and bribes and get more laws passed. If he tries to succeed by his own individual effort and denounces what's going on and says, well, look, the alternative is this, or bury myself in a grave and give up. I'm not going to give up. I'm still going to fight. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. If other than that, you would be saying, in a mixed society, you have to quit. And that is not true. You have to quit if it becomes a dictatorship. And then you have to go underground and fight it. But this is exactly why I said that in the talk you'd have to include, if your compliance is extorted, that is not the sanction of the victim. The sanction of the victim is a moral approbation, voluntarily granted, endorsing the people that are destroying you, or working to do that. Now here's one on the objectivist theory of concepts, God, morality. I just can't go into those. They're interesting questions, but they couldn't be condensed briefly. I was asked to give a presentation dealing with economics. The reaction was generally positive, but one recurring comment was that the audience felt it was being lectured to. Is this necessarily bad? And if so, how do you correct it? I'm not sure what they mean by being lectured to. It could simply, the only thing I can think of is that they mean there was a canned presentation that you were simply pouring the stuff out without trying to adjust your presentation to their requirements, their interests, their knowledge. If so, I've covered it. If it means something other than that, I don't know what it could mean. Do you want to elaborate? Yes. Do you have a question on this point?
Yeah.
Yes, go ahead.
I didn't have a question, but I've heard the same criticism, and essentially it's if an attitude taken by a speaker of talking down to the audience.
I was wondering, if you take the attitude, if you mean by being lectured to talking down to the audience, that of course is a very bad policy. Talking down to an audience amounts to telling them what they already know, treating them as though they're idiots, in a kind of schoolmasterish way, which would really antagonize an audience. They would tune out right away. And would be the equivalent if I take an audience, that, let us say, knows objectivism, and I come in and I say, Now, one basic principle is A is A. That's the law of identity. And I present it, as I would to a complete beginner, and they'll just tune out. But then the right way to say that is not that you were lectured to, because in a sense, whenever you talk, you're lecturing if it's an organized presentation, but that you're not gearing it to the requirements of the audience's context. In that case, you're not presenting it on a demanding enough level. Yes?
I found that people frequently mean by that they have a sense that they're being scolded or...
You say that audience have a sense that they're being scolded? This is in school then.
I say frequently what people mean
Yeah.
that if you lecture to is the sense that they're being scolded.
What would you mean by an audience being scolded by the lecturer?
You should have known better. I'm now going to tell you the truth. No, I'm going to like you, children.
Well, if you treat an audience as children, they will resent it. That's very uncommon in my experience, particularly in an era where professors bend over backwards to say they know nothing. Nobody knows anything and we're all ignorant together. I would simply grant you, if a lecturer comes in and behaves obnoxiously, and he says, I'm going to tell you something you should have known already, that's his contradiction, because if they should have known it, he had no business agreeing to the engagement. Then he was wasting his time, and it's ridiculous. But in the normal course of affairs, I have not seen this. Yes?
It's possible that the audience will get a sense that they're being morally condemned. If he brings even an economic issue across.
You think an audience might get a sense that it's being morally condemned? It's possible, but I'd be very careful before I would criticize a speaker on those grounds. It depends what audience and what issue. Maybe I should make this point again. I made it once, but just for the heck of it, to make sure that this sinks in. Tailoring your presentation to the audience's context does not mean to their cowardice, if any. In other words, if an audience does not want to pass moral judgment, and there is such a thing, if it wants to evade, if you have a Republican audience, for instance, not that they're all that way, but many are, and you want to take their context into account, that does not mean start off with the definition, I have an audience that evades, that doesn't want to hear moral principles, that wants to have their cake and eat it too, and I have to make them happy. Then you may as well simply give up any presentation. So your context means their knowledge, and you have to decide what things an audience should know and shouldn't. And if you think an audience is being evasive on a point that they should know better, and you nevertheless agree for some reason to speak, you have to say, I'm speaking on this premise. I regard it as suicidal to advocate capitalism and wage and price controls. I think it's wrong, it's destructive, it's immoral, and if the Republicans do it, I think it's a disgrace. And if that turns the audience off, you did the right thing, because on that level to that audience, they're trying to get away with murder. So therefore, understand, please, is very vital. When I say that you have to take their context into account, I don't mean they're waffling on morality if that's what it is. You have to judge. If it's honest confusion, that's one thing. But there is such a thing as evasion. And you have to be forthright. That's part of treating them as grown-up equals. I can't stress that enough. I don't want it sound to endorse appeasement by saying that you should take your context into account. How does one differentiate the concept non-rational from irrational? Irrational is against reason. Non-rational is reason doesn't apply to it. For instance, when we were talking about emotions, one view could be, emotions are simply a separate phenomenon, like your liver. Your liver is not irrational, but it's not rational in the sense that it's a product of your thought. Your liver is a product of whatever, genes and chemistry and its physical entities. It doesn't derive from your premises. So it's not that it is anti-reason, but it is not a rational organ. It's part of you who are a rational entity. It's non-rational. But irrational means anti-reason. And the point here was simply, as applied to emotions, since in fact they're products of reason, if you don't regard them as that, you will have to hold that they are irrational because they're not in fact dictated by nature. So nothing would then keep them in harmony with reality if your mind didn't. Now here's a question on art which squeezes in under the wire only because the topic of the presentation was on Romanticism, but I really can't go into it. How is romantic art delimited from other heroic art? I have to refer you to the Romantic Manifesto. I'll confine myself only to saying heroism is a very general term. It does not delimit any particular moral or aesthetic school. Heroism is in effect an extreme embodiment, an extreme consistent embodiment of a certain code of moral values. But that leaves wide open what code. It's like the term saint. You can have a hero of Christianity, which is what Jesus is supposed to have been, a hero of self-abnegation. Or you could have the Aryan Superman, who was the hero from the Nazi perspective, the Nazi hero, who was the extreme embodiment of brute force and blue eyes, sheer physical, but he was regarded as a hero in the sense of the ideal from that perspective. So when you say the heroic versus the non-heroic, you are cutting out only one thing, really. And that is the modern mixed economy compromiser type who says nothing is black or white, everything is gray, there is no good or evil, everybody's equally sort of rotten and sort of good. That type of view is excluded if you say you're for heroes. But that leaves open what kind of hero you're for, and therefore what kind of art is appropriate to expressing it. There is, for instance, Christian art, which holds the Christian view of a hero and presents it in completely non-romantic art. For instance, some of the medieval Adam and Eves. If you've ever seen those completely twisted, distorted, panic-stricken, bleary-eyed, blind, panicky faces being expelled from Eden, that is a perfect example of a man of faith giving up his life and his mind and his confidence completely. So you could say, in effect, that is an extreme embodiment of a man as a stylized hero of medieval Christianity. But that's not romantic art. When we talk about romantic art, we talk about a specific type of hero, not necessarily objectivism, because that would be too narrow. But the specific thing which makes the romanticist hero is self-generated action. The man who chooses his own values and won't give them up. Now you see, that distinguishes it from a Christian type of hero who wants to abnegate everything or sacrifice everything. It distinguishes it from simply a physical brute, a la the Nazis, but it leaves open a wide range of what he's after and whether he thinks he can succeed. So you could even have a Christian romanticist, a la Dostoevsky, where they hold passionate values and try to achieve them, but the passionate value is union with God. Or you could have, like Byron, a malevolent romanticist who holds passionate values and tries to achieve it and believes you can't. Or you could have what Mr. Rand calls chambermaid romanticism, where the person holds 2-bit values. You know, like getting married and living in a vine-covered cottage and making, a white picket fence, and just the very conventional values, and achieves it. So they're not settling for nothing, but it's not exactly an exalted viewpoint. But all of that would still, in a very generalized sense, be romanticism as opposed to naturalism. Now, for more details, I'll have to refer you to Mr. Rand's articles. Do you intend to teach the lecture course on objectivism next September? No, not next September, but I am thinking of giving a version of that course next spring, but I'll announce it at the end of this course. During the first lecture, you said all knowledge is conceptual. Did you intend to include self-knowledge in your use of the word knowledge, or did you mean just knowledge outside of the self? No, both. All knowledge, outer or inner. In both cases, the primary data is direct awareness, direct experience. Either the direct awareness of the physical senses, seeing, hearing, tasting, etc., or the direct awareness that is mediated by introspection, where you're directly aware of a toothache or of your thoughts process or of whatever the inner sensation happens to be. In either case, you have to start with unconceptualized, directly perceivable data. But in both cases, it becomes human knowledge only when you conceptualize it. That's true outer and inner. And you no more know the self in the human form without conceptualizing it than you know the outer world. Can you define in very simple terms, using at least one example for each word, the objectivist meaning? There's obviously somebody disillusioned from the past. The objectivist meaning and use of philosophy, epistemology, and ethics. I also need to know the difference between philosophy and epistemology and the difference between philosophy and ethics. Well, I can do it. I'm not going to do it, though, because this is really covered in one of the articles that was assigned, namely Philosophy Who Needs It. Ms. Rand goes over each of these topics, terms, defines it, and gives examples. I'll confine myself to saying this. Philosophy is the general term for the whole field, covering all of its branches. The other two terms are branches of philosophy. Epistemology is the basic branch, which covers the theory of knowledge. How do you acquire knowledge? How do we know? And that includes many sub-questions. Are the senses valid? How do we form concepts? What is reason? What are axioms? Can you be certain? Etc. Ethics is the branch which tells man how to live, what's right or wrong, what values to guide his actions. And that includes, should you be selfish or not? What is selfishness? What's the role of pleasure in life? Should you be honest? What is honesty? Etc. The overall is philosophy. These are two, epistemology and ethics are two of many other branches, by the way, but there I refer you to the West Point talk. Now, regarding the presentation on romantic art, there's an objection to my assessment. It says her topic was romantic art, not literature or some specific form. Therefore, her excellently chosen concretizations form a delimited variety, music, sculpture, etc., in the context of her presentation, and I think it was most appropriate. Therefore, I disagree with you. Please comment. I agree entirely under one consideration, if there were two, if there were the time and the means to make it objective. If your presentation is romantic art, and you have the time to cover more than one art, and the means to make it clear, including such a field as music and painting, absolutely that would be preferable. It would be a really warped presentation if art in general is your field to do just literature. But in 10 minutes, with the problems of being objective in the non-conceptual arts, I stick to what I said before. Now, here's one on H of the homework. This was asked a couple weeks ago, so let's look at H for a minute. And H was an axiom. H on page 6. Was H an example of too complex an issue to delimit it adequately? No. H was an attempt to define axiom. Now, of course, to make it clear to an audience and to motivate them, you couldn't do in that brief presentation, but this was simply a paragraph excerpted from a lengthier paper. And it was not intended to illustrate an issue too complex to delimit, because you can certainly give a definition of anything in a paragraph. Then it says, if it wasn't that, could I reword H and say it more objectively than it is on the sheet? Well, you want me to give a definition of an axiom, in other words. Not to repeat my criticisms of it, I would reword it approximately like this, but I say approximately because I'd have to, when you give a philosophic definition, you have to stand by every comma. And I'm here to give you just the essence, but I would say an axiom in philosophy is an abstract statement of self-evident perceptual data, a statement which serves as a primary of all human knowledge. That is, the three ideas you'd have to put in is it's an abstract statement which summarizes concrete perceptual data and which functions as a primary, as the start, as the beginning on which all subsequent knowledge depends. That makes it an axiom. It starts with direct self-evidencies, but that this is a table is not an axiom. That's simply a self-evident fact. That this is what it is an axiom, because that's an abstract statement, because it says everything is what it is. And what makes it an axiom is not merely that it's self-evident, but it's a starting point. Without that knowledge, implicitly or explicitly, you can't go anywhere. So it's an abstract statement of self-evident facts which functions as a primary, but I could word it better if we had time, but that's the idea. So you see, the statement is corrected. It has to be self-evident, but it is not worded in such a way as to distinguish the abstract statement from every concrete self-evidency. And I wouldn't use the word fundamental for the reason that I mentioned when I criticize it. If you mean by fundamental simply that on which everything else rests, okay. But fundamental is used in other senses also, and primary, I think, is more clearly a word which means first, beginning. It comes from prime, you see, where you start. Now, I had a couple from last week that made exactly the same point, so for what it's worth, let me read them. I found that this is now referring to last lecture, and it is referring to the presentation on capitalism to a audience of conservatives. One comment says, I found the pace of that presentation too slow to the point that the ideas started to seem disconnected. Isn't too slow a pace a problem as well? And here's somebody who says, you thought the pace of that talk was excellent. I found myself losing interest because of the many pauses and the generally slow pace. The numerous pauses made it difficult to keep the ideas threaded together. Now here are two people which I must say surprised me. How many had that reaction now that it's been said by several people? Well, that's quite a number. I must say I didn't see that, so I don't know how to resolve that objectively other than to say this. Are you listening to it as people who already know the answer, or are you listening to it as a completely outside audience? Now, here you were asked to listen to this from the perspective that you don't know the material. And I would deferentially suggest that the material that was covered in that presentation was so much that you could make the case, as we suggested last time, as I did, that there was too much packed in to be clear. If you found the pace too slow, I believe you are substituting your own understanding, your prior understanding, for the actual delivery. The best thing I can suggest to you is this. There's no use arguing about that one presentation. Go out and present ideas to people. Do it in a drawing room, do it, on the street, wherever. I mean, don't become a pest, but wherever it's appropriate. And you will soon get a clear idea of the level of things that people who don't know philosophy understand. And I think that you will very likely change your idea of pace and of what's required. I guarantee you that one set of examination booklets would do that for it. Now, here's a question. Beyond telling the speakers that they would speak for 10 minutes, did you assist them in any other way? What knowledge, if any, did you have of their content? In no other way except to specify the title of their talk and the type of audience, if any. I had no knowledge of their content. Now, this is a comment that was handed in last time about the first presentation last time, which was on, remind me. Oh, child rearing, right. It's not totally clear to me why you believe the skyscraper analogy was a great motivation. I thought it was okay, but my idea of motivation is if you don't listen, here's what bad thing is going to happen. And then the questioner goes on thus, he would start. Have you ever noticed today's teenagers standing on street corners smoking the latest drugs, uttering the latest slogans, seemingly without goals, etc., etc.? Then listen to me. Now, what did you think of that? I'll give you a chance to answer that first. He thinks that's better than the skyscraper analogy. Do you want to come to your defense? I'm speaking to the speaker of last time. Yeah. What do you think of that as an opening?
Well, I picked the skyscraper because I was trying to show how you can help construct,
She said she picked the skyscraper because she was deliberately trying to inculcate the idea that they have to build the child's character, that she wanted to get in other words, not just a motivation, but a certain cognitive content also, part to whet their appetite and part to give them the idea. I want you to think of yourself as architects and the child is the raw material and you have to build something out of him, right?
Well, the child builds himself, but you help him.
Yeah, but you help him, yes. That's a valid answer. I would say it all depends how you do it. The motivation that is suggested here is fine if you can make it convincing. I'll go this far if you don't hold it against me and say, I in fact think this motivation that's suggested in this questioner might be better if you can make it convincing. Because there's a certain academic quality to the skyscraper analogy. You know, that analogy goes back to Greece. You know, in the ancient world, and ethics is like building and building, and we have to have certain principles. And it's more grabbing if you say, look at these kids today, they're falling all over the place, they're going crazy and so on. Look, I'll save them, listen to me. If you can do it, but the only thing that would stop me is I couldn't deliver it in 10 minutes. Therefore, I would be torn between, I have a really racy opening, but it would fall completely flat because my time would be up before I could do it. Therefore, I would rather try to compromise this way. I have an interesting, motivating thing which doesn't commit me to too much in 10 minutes, and that's why I prefer the one that was done. If, however, you could get away with this, and you had some way of doing it, I would say that's even better because then you really hit them where they live. An audience, other things being equal, would rather save the child's life than build his character. So it's more vital. You had a question on this? Yes.
The example just given about the drug teenagers may be more dramatic, but the other one was a positive motivation. It established a positive goal.
Well, you said the example of the skyscraper is a positive motivation, gives a positive goal, and this is negative, simply how to avoid drugs. That's true, but that's not as decisive consideration per se, because it may very well be that the best way to motivate an audience is to strike terror and say, look what's happening, you better wake up, the world is going to hell and so are your children. Now I have a few still from the week before. I'd like to get rid of this pile. I'm passing by the one on Milton Friedman because I believe Ms. Rand covered that opening night. What is the proper, this goes back weeks, but you see if you're patient, I finally get to it. What is the proper domain of philosophy as contrasted with the special sciences? Is there any overlapping? Well, very briefly, the special sciences study one specific aspect of existence. For instance, physics would study matter and energy. Astronomy studies the stars, biology, living things, and so on. Philosophy studies universal principles. In metaphysics, for instance, it's what's the principles which are true of everything, whether material, psychological, or whatever. in epistemology, it's not simply how do you acquire knowledge of quantities or knowledge of chemistry, but knowledge of anything, and so on. Ethics, of course, pertains only to how man should act, but it's how he should act in any situation. So philosophy, the essential distinction is it's universal. Is there any overlapping? No, there should not be overlapping in the sense that philosophy cannot answer questions of specific factual content within a specific science. Then you have to study that particular data in that field. Philosophy cannot pontificate on physics, psychology, etc. There is a relationship, however, in that philosophy is the basis of the special sciences. Without a certain view of the universe, of existence, and above all, a certain theory of knowledge, there can be no special sciences. Is rationalism an outgrowth of the analytic-synthetic dichotomy? No, the analytic-synthetic dichotomy is an outgrowth of rationalism. I won't elaborate that, because presumably you understood if you asked that question. Rationalism goes back, I'm just correcting myself now. Rationalism goes all the way back to the ancient world, and the analytic-synthetic dichotomy was a modern development. Now here's a question which I'm hesitant to answer. Other than rationalization and evasion, can you name any important motivations for the systematization of such philosophies as Kant's, Hume's, etc.? First of all, evasion covers the waterfront, because that's it. According to objectivism, that is the essence of dishonesty, and everything else would be a form of it. So you can't say other than evasion. If you're talking about dishonesty, there's nothing left. So does this question mean, what makes me hesitate, do all philosophies that we disagree with, do we regard as dishonest? No, we do not. There are many philosophies objectivism disagrees with that does not regard as intrinsically dishonest, although we believe the person is mistaken. I don't believe Aquinas, for instance, was dishonest in his philosophy. I don't believe the Greek Stoics were dishonest. I don't believe Socrates was dishonest. I certainly don't think Spinoza, who was a saint in effect of integrity, was dishonest, and I could name many more. From that point of view, it's certainly, I would want to repudiate entirely the idea that we regard every philosophy with which we disagree as dishonestly motivated. What is true is that all philosophies which in essence are based on the explicit denial of reality and of reason have to be dishonest, and there we don't have to psychologize to pass that judgment, because the very essence of those philosophies is to say to hell with honesty. Honesty means a commitment to recognize reason and reality. Therefore, if a philosophy like Hume or Kant says openly reason is helpless and reality is out of the question, you know, it doesn't exist or it's unknowable, then they can no longer, by their own statement, claim honesty. So that's a different proposition. But understanding you're talking about a modern, essentially a modern phenomenon, the main motivation, or method at least, is evasion. Now, the motivation is, who knows? I wouldn't even begin to speculate. The unearned, to be a big shot, to cause trouble, to destroy, all kinds of possibilities. By the way, though, I would say, before you say that, you should be sure you know how to refute these philosophies, because if you go around saying Kant was a monster, Hume is vicious, and somebody says, oh, how do you answer such and such, and you're in a position you're saying, I have no idea what he preaches or why it's wrong, all I know is that he's vicious, you're in a very weak position, and also that is a fallacy of ad hominem. I therefore try to stay away from any personal criticism of philosophers for that reason. It is really unimportant in discussing their ideas. The main question is, are the ideas true or false? It's a completely separate question, are they honest or dishonest? What is the position of objectivism on the doctrine which states that logic is merely a branch of psychology? Complete repudiation of that doctrine. Logic is the method by which knowledge is to be acquired. It is a normative subject. It tells man how he must think if he is to acquire knowledge. And in essence, it says he has to think without contradiction. Psychology as a subject is a description of human nature, of human functioning, of the laws which actually do govern mental processes. And it is certainly not a law of psychology that man has to obey logic. He doesn't, as is evidenced by the many cases in which people think illogically. And therefore, logic is certainly not a branch of psychology. The theory which leads to this is Kant's, which is that logic can't be based on the facts of reality. It simply has to be a subjective description of the human mind. But of course, we reject that entirely. Objectivism holds what's called an ontological interpretation of logic, which is that logic is based on reality. Psychology is a special science. It has nothing to do in this regard with philosophy, or nor therefore with epistemology or logic, except that it should follow logic like every other subject. I've time for one, I just saw one written question. I'll pass on that. It asks me to pass moral judgment on the honesty of somebody, which I just assume not. But I don't think it's essential to this case. You want to have a final question? Yes?
In the first presentation, what did you think of the use of we?
We, W-E?
Yeah.
The first, remind me again, I'm lost, was the Romanticism. What was the use of we?
You know, the use of we constantly.
Oh, you mean?
You know, we like Rodin,
To include the audience, you mean? Yeah, there was a certain question. In fact, there's a certain criticism there, which it was sort of inherent in the motivation. The attempt of the motivation, you see from the outset, was to say, you and me, the audience and I, the speaker together, don't like what's going on today. And we want something better. And this is what Romanticism will give it. Now, there is a virtue and a vice to that. The virtue is, I think I even said, if you have a better audience, that's okay to say, but suppose you have an audience that doesn't necessarily see that or agree with you, or that likes what they see as the modern art, and you keep saying we, an audience can very reasonably object to that. You can simply alienate them. And it's a kind of crutch on your part because you're trying to, in effect, it amounts to saying, I can't prove all this, but I'm assuming you believe it too. Now, if you have to do that, it's better to say it openly. Because, especially a conscientious audience, never likes to be in a position where the speaker comes in effect. You know, there are teachers who do this and put their students in a really bad position. They come in and say, I'm sure we can all agree that free will is a myth. Now, the question is man determined by his heredity or environment? And we all know so-and-so. And they just, go right on, and it puts the audience, most of the students would agree with anything, but some of them get very upset by that, and legitimately, and they're put in a kind of quandary. They can't keep saying, I don't, because it looks like they're just making trouble, and on the other hand, they don't. And it's a very undesirable thing to do to an audience. So whenever you ascribe something to an audience, if it isn't, the kind of thing which they should be ashamed not to agree with, I would hesitate I think the point is well taken. I would do it better by saying a rational audience or, whichever would want such and such, and then if they don't like it, let them argue it. But to ascribe it directly to them, there's a certain difficulty. You want to defend yourself on that?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I tend to do that in the beginning. I tend to talk about audiences in general, plotted movies and stuff like that, and that's kind of a decent generalization, and I included them as the general audience. I did not say, we like Rodin.
She says she did not come right out and say we from the beginning. She tried at first to say she's talking about a certain kind of audience. So it's a question simply of how clearly it came across. I think part of the reason for the feeling of that crutch was the rush, and that you were trying to attach to whatever you could to keep you going when you couldn't really elaborate it. In any event, it's a worthwhile point to make. All right, we've reached our time. So let us conclude here. Thank you very much.